of our viewers and those joining us in the building to the Charlotte City Council Business Meeting for February the 14th. I want to especially express my appreciation for all of us on Valentine's Day. How special that is. It's a day of, I'm not quite sure I can say love, but definitely something in the air, and I hope everyone is enjoying their day. We have a meeting today that will include our action review, where we talk about those things that are coming up and moving forward in the next several weeks, and then we have several business items. But before we begin, I just want to make a note that tonight's meeting is being held in accordance with the applicable laws for remote meetings, and we have council members who are participating remotely, and know that we have met all the requirements that that are made by the law. I'm going to start with introductions of the council and staff in the room, and then we'll go to those that are attending virtually, and we'll start with our city clerk.
Stephanie Kelly, City Clerk.
I'm Vi Lyles, and I serve as mayor.
Marcus Jones, City Manager.
Malcolm Graham, City Council District 2.
Patrick Baker, City Attorney.
Kay Cunningham, Mayor's Office.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Julie Eiselt, Mayor Pro Tem and serving at large.
All right, any other at-large members?
Braxton Winston at large.
Greg Phipps at large.
Dimple Anchmira at large.
Larkin Eggleston, District 1.
Renee Johnson, District 4.
Clark Bakari, District 6.
Ed Driggs, District 7.
Victoria Wallington, District 3.
All right, thank you everyone for those introductions. And we begin our meeting with an invocation that solemnizes our proceedings, and we do this to support each other in our deliberations and actions that we take. And that tonight we're going to have Councilmember Eggleston provide us our invocation, and then we will follow with a pledge of allegiance to our flag. So, Councilmember Eggleston.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Tonight, given that we are in the midst of Black History Month, I thought I would share a poem from Langston Hughes. It's called I Dream a World. I dream a world where man, no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace its path adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth and every man is free. Where wretchedness will hang its head and joy, like a pearl, attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream, my world. Langston Hughes.
Thank you. Could we please stand for our pledge of allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks, everyone. All right. The first item on our agenda are the mayor and council questions, and Ms. Harris is going to give an overview to those questions, and at that point we'll then proceed following to see if there's any item that council would like to have a separate vote on, comment on, and I don't believe there are any staff deferrals on the consent item. So those will be our two choices tonight. So I'll begin with Ms. Harris.
Thank you, and good evening, Madam Mayor and Council. And you have in your emails the questions, and I was wanting to double check with Mr. Winston and Mr. Phipps to make sure that answer the information they needed, and with anyone else to see if there's additional information. Thank you, Mr. Phipps.
All right, Mr. Phipps and Mr. Winston are signaling virtually that they're okay. with the questions that were addressed. And so with that, I'd like to ask the council members of the consent items 23 through 43, are there any that you would like to see a separate vote? Is there anyone that would like to have a separate vote? All right, hearing no one with a separate vote, may I have a motion to adopt the consent items 23 through 43 for approval? Do I have a motion?
So move.
So moved, Driggs.
All right, Mr. Driggs and Mr. Graham, is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, I would like to say that we take this vote by roll call because of the requirements that we have everyone ready to vote. So with that, the first, we'll start with Ms. Watlington.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem,
Yes.
Ms. Ajmira,
Yes.
Mr. Phipps,
Yes.
Mr. Winston,
Yes.
Mr. Bakari,
Yes.
Mr. Driggs,
Yes.
Mr. Eggleston,
Yes.
Mr. Graham,
Yes.
Ms. Johnson.
Yes.
All right, then that, we've approved the consent items for this meeting. So thank you very much, everyone. The next item that we have will be a presentation by the city manager for the upcoming items that we have on our action review. So I'm going to turn it over to the city manager.
So thank you, Mayor and members of council. As you see tonight, we only have 2 items for the action review. We believe that they are 2 significant items, and we wanted to make sure we give council enough time to have a bit of a discussion. So Allison Craig will lead a discussion with the Charlotte Future 2040 Policy Map update, and then our city attorney, Patrick Baker, as he mentioned, I believe last month, would come back to you for a discussion with city ordinances updates. No request for an action tonight on it, but at least an opportunity to council take the first bite at these ordinance updates. So Mayor, unless there are questions, I'd like to turn it over to Allison.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us, Allison. You're up. Do you want to introduce the other staff members that you have with you tonight?
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you, Mayor and Manager and members of Council for the opportunity to update you here on the policy map. I'm joined here by Alicia Osborne, who is the project manager for the Charlotte 2040 plan, as well as the policy map, and she'll be giving the majority of the presentation. The policy map is an important part in implementing the comprehensive plan. It's the translation of the comp plan's place-based policies to specific geographies. The comment window closed on February the 8th, and staff has been working to process the comments that we've received on this second draft. What Alicia is going to talk to you tonight is what we've heard from council, what we've heard from the community, and what changes are being made as a result of the comments and the feedback that we've received. And also, if we aren't recommending changes, why we are not, and explaining that to you all tonight. We've had a lot of questions about what are the next steps. So the next steps with this next draft, which will come out on February the 21st, and so this will be the final recommended map. We will have an online tool that'll be available for people to comment on, and that'll be open through the end of March, which is when we're requesting council adoption, is on March 28th. And as you recall, one of the things we heard from you and from the community is they wanted a little more time, so we've extended the public comment period from February 28th to March the 28th. We've also had questions about what are the next steps after the map is adopted, how are changes being made, and so Alicia will talk through some of those as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, members of council, mayor, and for the opportunity to share about the 2040 policy map. This is the overview of the presentation. Next slide, please. So this is the schedule. Here's where we are with the project. As Allison mentioned, we started last year after the 2040 Comprehensive Plan was adopted, working on this process to map the place-based recommendations within the plan on the map. So if you look at this schedule, we started in July, and now we're here in February, still continuing to iterate with the draft map, working with the community. But if you think of how these three documents or three initiatives work together, the comprehensive plan essentially said, here's our vision and how we want to grow. The policy map essentially provides guidance on where we grow. The mobility plan helps us to understand how we connect in the areas that we are growing in throughout our community. And the UDO, the Unified Development Ordinance, talks about the development rules to make it all work and make it happen. Next slide. So you guys have seen this slide before, but for those who might be joining us for the first time, the 2040 policy map is again a translation of those place-based principles within the comprehensive plan and actually placing it on the map to guide how we think about and balance our future needs and opportunities around growth throughout our community. What's really important about this map as well is that it provides updated land use policy throughout our entire community. We haven't done that since the 90s, where we looked throughout all of our parcels and provided updated land use policy, which will essentially be the foundation for doing future planning initiatives. And I'll talk about those future processes later on in the presentation. And what it also does is introduce a new way of thinking about places and how we use land use, and thinking more about building form and character. How do we address mobility and open space in our, as we think about how we grow and develop over time. Next slide. So the map was developed using that new tool called place types. That's the mapping tool that provides us the more holistic, comprehensive way of looking at how we will grow in the future. So if you look at the image, it looks at not just how you use the land, but different ways of mobility, how you move around the community, and just how things connect holistically. And so the place type tool is what allows us to think more comprehensively about how we grow and develop over time. Next slide, please. So more importantly, what the policy map is what it is not. I think we all know that this work can be extremely complex and confusing to the average person. So this slide has been really useful in our communications and engagement opportunities to share what the policy map is and what it's not. And so if you think about the left-hand side of the screen, it's more visionary. We're talking about principles and goals within the place types and general concepts about height and how things are arranged. What our Unified Development Ordinance does is provide the legally enforceable rules to achieve that vision or those concepts that are described within the comprehensive plan in which the map says we should grow, how we should grow over time. And so those are the kind of fundamental differences between those two major initiatives. And this slide has really been helpful in having those conversations with the community to make those distinctions, because this really is some complex work, but it's important work. So we want to make sure that our residents and those who are involved understand how these things all fit together. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we've done quite a bit of engagement as we started with the comprehensive plan and then transitioned to the policy map. The process was divided into 3 distinct phases to make sure that each phase of the project, we were engaging the community at every step of the process. So the first step started in July, and we talked about education around what is a policy map, what are we trying to do, and then to kind of poll the community about some of their preferences around adjacencies or how these land uses relate to each other, so that can better inform how we develop the map. And so the first map was released last summer, and then the second map was released this phase of the project and the third phase of the project. At the bottom of the screen, you will see the 24 engagement methods that we've used throughout this project to meet people where they are in person as well as virtually. And I will say that the most impactful conversations we've had have been the one-on-one conversations where staff is really listening, folks are really paying attention, and they have a better understanding about this difficult work than we give them credit for a lot of times. So they come to the conversations really prepared with their issues, with their questions about this process and how it impacts how we grow and develop in the future. So those one-on-one conversations have really been impactful, and we plan to continue that in all the phases of the project. Next slide, please. So here's engagement by the numbers, kind of the totals. We started out with the survey responses. There was a postcard that was sent out to every resident. Over 200,000, close to 300,000 postcards were mailed to each parcel within our community, asking people to participate in the survey and to also make them aware of the project so they can stay connected along the way. And then you'll see between phase 2 and phase 3, there were a drop in the numbers of comments received. I'll talk a little bit later about why, but generally speaking, a lot of the comments were reduced because the second draft of the map pretty much addressed their comments that were mentioned in the first draft. And then we envision in the next draft of the map, we'll see an even greater decrease in the numbers because we're working with our partners, our internal partners and other departments to refine the map, helping people to understand the purpose of the map as well. And so we're having some really great conversations about what the map is and what it is not. Next slide. So here's some key takeaways from that engagement, and you'll see it reflected in the map and some of the comments moving forward. Prioritize preservation, particularly our neighborhoods, make sure that our neighborhoods stay intact. Provide more opportunity for higher density in our where existing infrastructure can support it, and that's particularly along our transit corridors, our major thoroughfares, and thinking about how to provide those more intense or dense developments in those locations. Make sure that as we're thinking about our activity centers, our places for employment, that they're the right sizes in the right location. We've heard a lot from our residents in the West Side, as an example, about being mindful of the amount of industrial that's in that area. So making sure we understand and provide job opportunities while balancing that need for respecting the adjacency of potential adverse impacts of like industrial uses in the future. So that's one of the examples of that. And also we heard a lot about transitions, really thinking about and being forward thinking along our corridors where there's existing commercial today. How might we think about those areas transitioning to more neighborhood center, introducing more walkable, more neighborhood serving type of land uses over time? So where there may be a gas station today, how might we be more intentional about placing future land uses that may complement that over time, as well as providing the right building character and form? Next slide. Next slide. So the next series of slides, I'll walk through some of the examples. So here's the second draft of the policy map. As Allison mentioned, the comment period for that closed last Friday, February the 11th. But this map was designed to make sure that residents and anyone who would view it understood where the recommendations or changes from the first draft were to the second draft. So the circles on the map indicate changes that were made from the first draft to the second draft. If you click on that particular circle, a table or a comment box will pop up explaining the different iterations. So you can see the evolution of changes and why. And then if you need more detail, you can click on the individual parcel and then you'll get a description about what the place type is and then what that means for that particular area. So the online mapping tool is pretty robust in that it provides a lot of information and allows people to see what others have said about their areas as well. Next slide. So here's the breakdown of the place types from the map, the adopted policy, land use policies that we use today. That's the top. And the different colors translate to the place type assignments from the first draft of the map and then to the second draft. Let's start with the residential. So there was a big push and definitely a common goal for us to make sure that the neighborhood areas were preserved. And so you see that reflected in the percentage of what we're identifying as residential. Next, you'll see from the policy that we have today to the drafts of the policy map, you'll see a significant increase in parks and open space. So as we grow, we wanted to make sure that we identified those areas for parks, no matter what size they were, but be real intentional about understanding where our parks are planned, where they are today, and how they relate to our neighborhoods. The next colors in the map, or the next sections or place types in the map, really speak to employment, the opportunities to provide jobs, and the mixture of uses in our activity centers. And so that's where the remainder of the map provides the supporting uses for where we live, work, and play. Next slide. So you've seen, and the last time I presented to y'all, you've seen really detailed information about the different revisions, so I'll summarize them into 3 big buckets. Here's the live place types where you have your parks, preserves, neighborhood 1 and neighborhood 2. Again, the key revisions in that second draft made sure that we responded to everyone's goal, ours and the community's goal, to preserve where our existing neighborhoods are, but also understanding where future parks might potentially go as well, and also making sure that we understand the relationship between our historic districts and future growth in the area. Next slide. The other 2 are around work and play place types. Again, for the workplace types, we looked at the airport-owned property, making sure that we understood the future of their development, looking at the noise contours, making sure we're not recommending residential in those areas, looking at campuses like our university campuses, our medical campuses, understanding their growth and how they support job opportunities and our community as well. And then also looking at manufacturing and logistics and light industrial mixed use or innovation mixed use. Thinking more creatively about, as our community grows, how might we accommodate different types of jobs in our community, and where might they go? And how can we use our existing building footprints or provide an opportunity for new places as well? And then the other changes were around the activity centers, making sure that we are intentional about how these activity centers transition or relate to our existing neighborhoods, and provide a transition from busy corridors to the neighborhoods as well. Next slide. So the next couple of slides, I'll walk through some examples of changes that were made from the first draft to the second draft, and some changes that we're considering for this next round. So this one is an example of where we were looking at the transition from the darker blue, which is a community activity center, to a more predominantly single-family neighborhood. And so what you see on the left-hand side of the screen is a recommendation that we originally had for neighborhood 2, but looking more closely and working with the neighborhood, we changed it to neighborhood 1 to be more consistent with the use and character of that area. I wanted to make sure that we all remember that this process is kind of a, I want to say 10,000 foot approach to providing updated land use for over 300,000 parcels within our community. There might be mistakes or inconsistencies, but we'll talk about how we plan to refine that in the future in other planning initiatives. So this is to really just set the foundation for how we plan to plan in the future. So next slide. Here's another example. Really just going back to the whole notion about how we look at commercial in our corridors. This particular area is one of our areas, corridors of opportunity. And right now it's zoned for commercial. All the plans before it says that it should be commercial, but understanding that our direction is more now to support our transit investment in that area, and how the community is really working hard to transform this corridor. So we wanted to make sure that our visioning around those transformational areas are aligned. So we are making a transition from commercial to neighborhood activity center to reflect our work with the corridors of opportunity across the city. So this is just an example of what that change in the methodology looked like. Next slide. Here's another example of where we've worked really closely with the community to make some adjustments. Again, understanding that transition from community activity center, which is the blue, to recognize where our future streetcar will go, but understanding that there are existing neighborhoods in that area. So we were thinking that it was more of a neighborhood activity center. Also looking at the bottom of the screen, understanding that there's Independence Boulevard. So it's sandwiched between two major infrastructure investments in our community. So working closely with the community, having those intense conversations, we were able to make some adjustments that were more aligned with where our visioning is for that particular neighborhood. Next slide. Here's another example of where we're looking to really make some alignments on the map and in future planning initiatives. On the left-hand side, the purple is an existing shopping center or neighborhood center. And so the recommendation was for neighborhood 2, which still allows for small-scale retail, but thinking how do we create a better street frontage or relationship between both sides of the street. So we're recommending a small change to a neighborhood activity center for that particular location. Next slide. Again, one of the other examples within one of our neighborhoods, looking at the transition at the bottom from a neighborhood activity center back to the single-family neighborhood. How do we be more thoughtful about that transition? So that's a particular example where we're looking to change it from neighborhood 1 to neighborhood 2 to be consistent with the transition of the land use pattern on the southern part of that slide of that the street. Next slide. And the last example, as I mentioned, there will be some instances where we don't change the map. And we will make sure that moving forward that we communicate with this body as well as the community. Here's the comment we received. Here's the evolution of the change in the map, if there was one, from the first draft to the second draft, and also in the third draft. Here's why it changed or not. And so then the discussion becomes more around why didn't something change, to help build that level of understanding of, is this something we change now or something that warrants further analysis in our future planning initiatives, where we can have that more granular conversation about land use, what's on the ground, what's planned, what are the transportation or infrastructure investment that need to go in that particular area. So in this example, it's near Uptown. We're recommending Regional Activity Center because Uptown is one of those regional activity centers, and understanding that that's the appropriate recommendation for this particular area. We heard some concerns from the neighborhood, but this recommendation is aligned with the existing development, the future requested development pattern, and the existing zoning that this development has. So in this instance, we are not recommending a change, but we'll make sure moving forward in the process that we communicate why or why not. Next slide. So here's some of the outstanding issues. I mentioned some of these as I was talking about some of our particular examples, but one thing we'll continue to do is clarify the messaging around the map. What the map really is. I think there's some confusion, rightfully so, about the map and what the Unified Development Ordinance will or will not do. So there's some questions around setbacks and those types of things when we're talking about the map, that those discussions might be more appropriate during the Unified Development process. But we'll continue to push that message and continue to educate people about the different processes. And then looking at some piecemeal revisions, As I mentioned, those examples I showed, they really are looking at a particular block in a particular area that will warrant that type of revision. But we'll talk a little bit later about how we plan to address those types of revision and future planning initiatives and amendments to the map. We'll work closely with our internal partners about the campus and Silver Line recommendations. They're right in the middle of working on the station area plans and making those, I guess, projections about development. So we want to make sure that our work is aligned. And then there's other corrections that we want to make as we learn more, particularly about recent rezonings, making sure that the map reflects the recent entitlements or recent direction and rezonings that you all have approved. Next slide. So what happens after the policy map? So as we show, Allison mentioned a tentative adoption date is March 28th. We're envisioning the effective date for the map to be July 1st. That will help staff and the community to understand what the map is and how to use it, give us a little bit of lag time. What is envisioned to happen is that we retire the current land use tool. So the map that we use today, the Adopted Future Land Use Map, will be retired and replaced by the 2040 policy map. And the map will also be used to make future land use decisions and capital investments. And so a lot of our planning beyond this point will help us to monitor and track progress of the comprehensive plan. How do we know that our decisions and our policy work and our implementation actions are actually achieving the goals that we set out for? And then how do we refine the comprehensive plan moving forward? And then we'll start to initiate supporting planning initiatives like community area plans, transit station area plans, and other strategic plans as needed. Next slide, please. So here's a timeline of some of that activity, and they're kind of in three buckets. So we'll adopt the policy map first this spring, and then the Unified Development Ordinance, which is the rules to accommodate the policy map this summer. We will produce an annual report for the comprehensive plan. It's all outlined in the plan, which was adopted by this body, that holds us all accountable for reporting and tracking our progress, and we'll produce that annual report every year. We also plan to relaunch our Community Planning Academy. Throughout these big initiatives, we have created some really robust engagement platforms, and we want to make sure that when we are working with the community that there isn't an initiative where we start the conversation, that we continue to have these conversations and educate our community at all levels about the planning process and why it's important and how they can play a role in that. And we're also we'll be developing a community planning toolkit. There are a lot of communities or neighborhoods that are really, really good at planning, and they have planning experts and engineers on their boards. But there are certain parts of our community who may not have those resources. So how do we help them to start that process on their own, give them the tools to start their planning processes before we even get to them for a community planning process in the fall of next year. Next slide. So the plan, the comprehensive plan provides kind of our planning approach. Again, the comprehensive plan will be updated every 10 years, but every 5 years kind of doing an assessment based on our annual reports. And then we'll continue to do our city and countywide plans like our strategic mobility plan, our parks plan, and then get more granular with our community area plans and our area-wide specific plans like our transit station area plans. The point of it all is that planning continues, and this is how the hierarchy of the plans will be and how we plan to update the comprehensive plan by these using these other planning initiatives over time. Next slide. So here's how we're thinking that the policy map can be updated. Again, we know it's not perfect, and that we know that there will be amendments needed to the map. So we're thinking that we'll do that annually right now. and it'll be informed by policy and regulation changes. So as we learn more, we will have that flexibility to adjust to things that we learn over time. So in terms of policy changes, really looking at the community, using the community area planning process, our capital improvement process, and just some plans that are not only our department, but our partners may develop that may impact where our thinking around the policy map. So that's one way. The other way is also looking for inconsistencies as we're making decisions and revisions to the map over time. How do we keep track of that and make sure that we're changing as needed from a policy perspective? And we also know that there will be some changes to the policy map needed based on some of our regulatory changes, making sure that as we have rezonings in the future, how do we make sure that the policy map is aligned with those and providing a process for that to happen, and also providing a process that is predictable and transparent and that people can still have input as these changes are being made for both the policy and the regulatory side of things. Next slide. So here's the next steps for the map. Before this body tonight, tomorrow night, we'll go to Planning Committee to provide an update similar to what we are discussing tonight. We'll release a third draft of the map, which will be our recommendation for adoption and approval. Residents will have the opportunity to provide you guys directly with some of their comments at a public comment session on the 28th. We'll then continue our discussions with the Planning Commission and come back to council on March 28th for council action. Next slide. And we'll use the same engagement tools for the final map that we're using now to make sure that residents have the opportunity to provide comments. And I'll take any questions you may have.
Well, I'm sure there are going to be more, but I want to recognize Mayor Pro Tem Isold, and followed by Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Alicia, for the update. I know this has been a tremendous amount of work in trying to engage with everybody that has been commenting, and I'm so glad to see the engagement, but I know that it is a lot. But I have a couple of questions just to clarify. The release of the final recommended policy map is February 21st. But that doesn't, if you could just clarify, that doesn't mean that there couldn't still be technical corrections on a parcel by parcel basis after that. Is that right?
Yes, the comment period for that map starts the day it's released and doesn't close until you all adopt the map. So the tools that I shared at the end of the presentation are the means in which people can provide comments. So that's the online application. If someone wants to have, as they always have throughout the process, a one-on-one conversation with staff, they can email us and have those. If it's a group, same thing. And we'll make available hard copies at our libraries as we have throughout the process.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure that was still the case. And then the second question I have is, could you speak to the topic that I know you've gotten a lot of emails on with regards to the, I don't want to say conflict, but in some ways it's conflicting visions of the historic districts that tend to butt up against areas that we intentionally want to see more density. And so, you know, there's been a lot of concern from people that threatens the character of the historic districts. Have you made changes based on those comments, or could you just speak to that a little bit?
So we have had conversations with two parts of our community with really intense conversations around the adjacency of kind of community activity center, let's call it what it is, the more intense activity center, and the neighborhood, particularly where the historic boundaries are outlined. What I will say is that the historic district boundary does not prevent higher intensity adjacent to it. What it does is protect the character of the development that's within it. And so existing zoning still applies, existing land use still applies to those particular parcels. So in the areas, we were consistent as much as we could be with the vision of what that historic district does. So to that point, the place type map does not absolve historic district boundaries. That's what rules, and the development regulations and entitlements within that is what supersedes. And I think there might be some conditions, particularly along South Boulevard, where there's existing TOD or existing entitlements, and our map reflects those entitlements and the future development that is anticipated in those areas. And I think there's just a fundamental difference, or I want to say concern, about the adjacency of the two that this map can't necessarily resolve, if that makes sense. So what I will say is that staff is looking at transitions. How do we look at height? There are some conversations about how do we make sure that we're providing provisions that from a regulatory standpoint, the details of that, I'm not sure of, but we are having those conversations in light of the concern about the adjacency between historic district and more intense development in our activity centers.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Alicia. I just needed clarification on a few items. The first thing I wanted to ask, when we approved the 2040 plan, we talked about 3 phases in the approval process. And throughout the presentation, I didn't see any reference to that. So can you remind us and the public how the approval process is going to work? Is this the phase 1, or where are we as far as the phases and the approval and the timeline?
So I'll speak to, and I'll ask Allison to talk about it in more detail, but I'll just, you're exactly right in terms of the document being originally one document and then put into 2 different parts. The policy document was the first part. The second part was the implementation strategy, and then the third part being the manuals and metrics. In terms of adoption of that, we had conversations at the beginning of this, well, not the beginning, but partway through this conversation with the policy map, where we were given direction to focus on the policy map adoption right now. But where the other 2 pieces are, I'll let Allison speak to the direction on where we are with that.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, I think it was last fall we heard from council that the community just wanted additional time to really talk through those 2 parts of the comprehensive plan. And then we also have council committees that are tasked to work through really important parts of the implementation strategy, in particular the NEST and the equitable infrastructure. So we don't have dates for adoption of those documents, but we're still talking through those details now.
Okay, so you said the policy document, the implementation, and then the metrics?
Manual and metrics, yes, those 2.
So if we're adopting the policy document first, is that when the policy would be implemented or applicable, or is it after all 3 of the phases are completed?
So the policy map is, as we were saying in the beginning, that's the translation of the place-based policies into specific geographies. That is the policy map. So the policy map is the implementation tool for those place-based policies from the plan. So the implementation strategy is something that there's a lot of other efforts underway to work through. So I mentioned the other committees. We also have a community benefits task force. And so we really want to talk through those particular efforts before adopting that particular strategy.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the policy map is going, the final adoption is 3/28. and then we are adopting the policy. And are we implementing the policy at that time?
So the comprehensive plan was adopted last June, so that is an adopted policy that we are working from. And so the map will then translate that to the ground. There are a lot of different plans and programs and ways in which the comprehensive plan is fully implemented, and it certainly is not all going to take effect at once. It's a 20-year vision for growth, and so we will work through those through different ways in order to fully implement that.
Okay, so it's going to be implemented once it's adopted, but the implementation strategy is kind of just tweaking it and kind of ongoing perfecting and improvement of it.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Ms. Johnson, Mr. Jones wanted to address your question as well.
Okay.
So thank you, Councilmember Johnson. What we will do for you, and Allison, I want to make sure we can do this. It's actually a crosswalk from where we started. As Allison said beforehand, it was one document, then we had 3 documents, and over time, the language has changed in terms of how we identify those documents. I think what you're asking is council wanted to be able to approve all of these elements of the plan, and I don't believe anything has changed. Let's just make sure we're using the right terminology so that you can feel assured that what you voted on last year is what we're doing. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. And my second question is, so I guess on March 28th, when it's implemented, how will that change the rezoning process? Like, how does that change as far as the neighbors or the residents' input? How will that change the rezoning process once the policy map is adopted?
It doesn't. What does change is the tool that you all use. It replaces the adopted future land use map that we currently use. So that's the policy, and this map will replace that. But the process for rezoning does not change.
So it's my understanding that once the policy map is implemented and the neighborhoods are assigned their place type, if a rezoning petition fits that neighborhood type, then the public comment or the public input process or step is no longer required.
No, it stays the same. The rezoning process stays the same. What does change is the tool that the land use guidance or land use policy that is used to base those decisions on. So the process itself stays the same. So if there's a inconsistency in what the developer wants and what the map says, then you go through rezoning. The process for filing, community engagement, all that stays the same. It doesn't change.
Okay, maybe I need more clarification, or I need to ask it a different way. Currently, when an area is conditional rezoning, the public hearing or public input process is not required because it's conditional. After this map is approved.
No, Ms. Johnson, wait, I think we want to make sure we're right on the first statement. So, Alicia, would you?
So for conditional rezonings or conditional zonings, the public process is required. This map doesn't change that process at all. It doesn't change the rezoning process. So there's still if the landowner is seeking a different zoning than what's already there on the ground, the process for doing that stays the same. The only thing that changes is what staff and the community uses from a land use perspective or policy perspective. This map updates the current map that you all use today. So the rezoning process stays the same. There will just be new updated guidance for land use policy in which to make those decisions.
I think it's important that we're really clear on this process, and perhaps I mean the conventional process. There is a process in our rezoning that when a developer is developing a certain plot that's unconventional or not conventional, there's a public hearing, and for some development or rezonings, there's not. So it's conventional, or maybe we should have someone else speak on the zoning process. But the concern is, once there are more rezoning petitions that are, and I'm sorry, I have some background noise, but once there are more rezoning petitions that fit the place types, the developers won't need the input from the public for those petitions. So I need clarification on what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think you're describing two processes. The first one is a scenario where the land use policy says A and the zoning says A. There's no rezoning needed. That's conventional, where you just go straight to, that development just happens. Then there's a scenario where A is the policy and then B is the zoning, and there's a misalignment or there's some type of development, and then you go through a rezoning process. And depending on what type of district you might, well, it's a rezoning process. So that triggers an application, community engagement, all of that. So those are, I think, the two scenarios you're describing, where there's an inconsistency with the policy and the proposed zoning that the developer wants. Then they come through the rezoning process.
Correct. Thank you. Thank you. So once this map is adopted and a neighborhood, and it's like neighborhood 1, or the developer will not have to go through the rezoning process. It will essentially be a conventional, correct?
If the land use guidance, say the policy map says it's neighborhood 1, there is a corresponding zoning district to the place types for neighborhood 1. Say that's already on the ground. So the policy says neighborhood 1, the zoning said neighborhood 1. There's no use for a rezoning if the two things align.
Right. So it feels like our rezoning petitions are going to decrease significantly. I think that was part of the goal for the 2040 plan.
The part of the goal of the plan was to better align our land use vision with our regulatory guidance, which may, but we can't say for sure, may result in a decrease in rezonings if that alignment is better, but we can't say for sure. Time will only tell what that will look like, and if those changes, if that type of direction will actually happen. We can't say that now until we map everything and then know for sure.
And if I could just jump in too, just to clarify, so we are anticipating that there could be a reduction in the number of rezonings, but that's really a function of having really outdated policies. And so all of the rezonings that you all hear that warrant very little discussion, those are probably the ones that will be better aligned with the current policy, and we'll be able to move forward with those. The ones that are significant changes to what adopted policies are, those will continue to have, I'm sure, robust discussion among council. I also wanted to mention too that right now we've got conditional rezonings and we've got conventional rezonings. The conventionals don't require community meetings. All of the rezonings going forward, as proposed in the UDO, will have a community meeting as part of them.
Okay, if they're conditional or conventional?
Correct.
Okay. My next question, Allison, since you're at the podium, the last time we talked, you mentioned that you were working or asking about the government television station and engagement or videos or some outreach through the government television station. Is there an update on that?
Great question. Thank you for asking. There was a presentation, I believe, last week or so, I can't remember the exact date where we were on the Gov channel, but we're launching a new series on that channel starting, I believe, on the 22nd. And so I'll be happy to provide that information for your weekly email. But yes, we are launching a series for the Gov channel.
Okay. And then we also talked about, as far as engagement, some type of website or something on the web page that shows how all of these policies align, such as the UDO and the TMN and the comprehensive plan and all of that. Has there been any progress on that? Do you know?
I know that staff has been working on that. We have a website now that has all those initiatives there, but I think it was something we wanted to provide a little bit more information and be more clear about where that location is for you all. So we're working on that and hope to have an update soon.
Okay. And then lastly, can you give a brief overview or any update on short-term rentals? We did receive an inquiry about that, as you know. Is there anything that the public should be aware of or significant changes that we're looking at in the short-term rentals?
Sure. We are not at a point in which we're ready to make recommendations for specific changes in the UDO as it relates to short-term rentals. We have, of course, heard a lot from the community on that particular topic, and we have scheduled a series of listening sessions for topics that are generating a lot of comments on the UDO. And so this coming Thursday will be a discussion on heritage trees, and then the following Thursday will be short-term rentals. This is an opportunity to hear from the community. There'll be very limited staff presentation on the topics, and individuals can sign up to attend and speak directly to the UDO team.
And that's this coming Thursday?
This Thursday is heritage trees, and then it's the next Thursday will be short-term rentals.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
That's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Kashmira? Ms. Kashmira?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have a few comments and some questions. So Alicia and Allison, thank you so much for addressing majority of my concerns and questions. Over past several weeks, I had received, or past several months, I've received comments about the place type maps and specifically around preserving historic neighborhoods and neighborhood character. So that comment has been addressed. So it's great to see. I would like to see a comprehensive list of all the comments, and I know that staff is working on that. I look forward to reviewing those comments, what's been addressed and what's pending and why, the reason behind that. One point that I consistently have heard in feedback on our 2040 policy map is that we need to clarify to homeowners or property owners that there is no change or there is no decrease in density, especially those who may not be as engaged in this process, in 2040 policy map process. We had gotten several feedback on that where property owners were concerned about whether they were going to get less density because of this exercise that we are doing with 2040 policy map and the UDO. So I think there just needs to be more clarification in our messaging. If anything, this might result in higher density, but not anything less than what you currently have. So Allison and Alicia, if you could just confirm that, and how can we go about clarifying that message moving forward? Do you want to comment on that, or do you want me to continue and then you can respond all at once?
Oh, I can go ahead and respond to that.
Sure.
You're exactly right. I think the resounding number that was expressed during the comp plan is that Charlotte is expected to grow additional 400,000 people over the next 20 years. And depending on who you talk to, 150 or so people move here every day. So it would not be a good idea for us to talk about decreasing density, but being more thoughtful about increasing it in the appropriate locations. So that's what this map essentially does, is recognize the anticipated growth of the community, but being real intentional about placing it where our infrastructure can support it, protecting our neighborhoods and open space while providing opportunities for job growth. And so that's our message, and we'll continue to push that out with this project and moving forward as we continue to plan for Charlotte.
Thank you, Alicia. And I just would like clarification on process for changes afterwards. So once the policy map is adopted, I heard that revisions will be made annually. There might be unintended changes that we might find out later after adoption. So is that a year, every year those changes will be made? I just want to understand that I heard that correctly.
That's our thinking now. I think what is really important about moving forward and thinking about changes is that we make sure we create a very transparent process in doing that. And so in the next couple of months, for sure, we have some ideas of how to do that, but making sure that we're transparent in that process and then predictable as well. So the annual policy map update may align with the annual report for the comp plan, just thinking how can we align some of these big policy impact initiatives and making sure that our community is expecting them and then they know how to participate in creating those types of changes throughout the process. We know rezonings will continue to happen, and then as we learn more about new development that may have impact, we'll start to record and make sure that we're tracking those. They may not be inconsistent with what we have adopted, but in those instances where there are, we want to make sure that we're tracking it and then making sure we're thoughtful about making adjustments to the map in a transparent and predictable way moving forward.
So I agree that transparency and predictability is key as we have a process for changes that come after the adoption. But time is of an essence here. So when someone has to wait for a year for the changes to be made, I think that could be a frustrating experience. So what I would like to see is some sort of standard process where it meets certain criteria where we don't have to wait till a year. But I look forward to some of the recommendations that staff has. I think year just seems like a very long time if there are plans underway and just the policy map we adopted, I'm sure there would be this is not going to be perfect. I mean, we are looking at hundreds of thousands of parcels. So I'm sure there will be a few here and there where we didn't get it right. And we got to have a standard process where it doesn't require a property owner to have to wait for a year. So I would like to understand that process, and I would like for that process to be part of our overall approval. So just so that I have an assurance that yes, there is a process, there is a standard process in place. If we didn't get it right, here is another way to get it right. Other thing, I just want to applaud you all for your one-on-one dialogues and back and forth dialogues with some of our residents. And I hope that you continue that as you move forward with the next phase. Thanks so much, ladies.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Driggs? Mr. Driggs?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to clarify a little bit the conversation that Ms. Johnson had with the staff. I think she was asking some very good questions. So to be clear, if you want to develop a site in a way that is consistent with its existing zoning, that's called by right. You do that by right and there's no involvement of council. If you want to do it in a way that's different from the existing zoning, then you have the two choices. You can seek a conventional rezoning, which allows for all of the uses within the type that you're applying for, or a conditional one where you submit a site plan. In our existing policy, the conditional rezoning calls for a community meeting and the conventional rezoning does not. So I think what we were just told was that distinction will no longer apply. Allison, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. A community meeting will be required for both.
All right, so the community required for all of them. I think the outlook for how many rezonings we're likely to see is partly a function of how good a job we do with this map in sort of putting in place zoning categories that are consistent with what people want to do with those locations. So personally, I think that what's going to happen is because the task of creating this map is so huge, I think a lot is going to come out in the course of our continuing process. I think we need to regard the first year after we adopt this map as kind of a trial period or, breaking in kind of thing. And it seems to me very possible that there could be a lot of people who want to change whatever was assigned to them as a result of the creation and adoption of our map. So I think one question I have is, how do you decide if somebody comes along and says, I think this category, this assignment that I got is wrong. I think it was wrong in the first place and I want it changed, versus I would like to change this because I have something else in mind. And in particular, what I'm talking about is, does the staff decide about changing the map, or do we decide about changing the map? Or what distinction are we making between those two?
So I can speak to the policy map changes and how that could possibly play out and what we're thinking preliminarily. One, changes to the policy map will require council adoption and approval. So that's not a decision that staff can make arbitrarily. The two types of changes that we're anticipating are through policy mapping processes or planning initiatives like community area planning, or the other one would be a change that is because of some regulatory action. Say there is a rezoning that happens and there needs to be a change. Some of the examples we're looking at in terms of process, I think Memphis has it, Raleigh, Nashville, where when there is a change in the policy map as part of a rezoning, it becomes a two-part action. So at that one time, council is deciding potentially a revision to the map as they're changing the zoning for that particular parcel. Like, that's a process that we're thinking through, working with our entitlement services team. And to your point, Mr. Driggs, you didn't say it, but I know you're thinking it, that we need to make sure that it's a very succinct process and transparent, and that people know what that process is and how can it be done succinctly and not be drawn out in terms of making those types of changes.
I was thinking that. Well done. Yeah, you're right. The other thing that I think I understand from our past conversations is there will be a continuing process for creation of area plans and conversions, I guess, that runs on for quite a while after these first adoptions. So we're going to adopt the policy map, and then there's going to be a 3-month period where the policy map has been adopted, meaning that the place types created by the policy maps are now effective, but
Right.
we still have the old zoning categories. So, and doesn't there need to be, or for one, in that 3-month period after we adopt the map and before we adopt the UDO, don't we have a kind of a mismatch between our existing ordinances and the map?
Yes, and there is a kind of a lag between both projects when they're adopted and also when they become effective. And there will be some inconsistencies between the two in that time period. But also, there will be some time when the zoning districts need to be mapped as well, and that will happen in phases. And so to your point about the rezoning process, we know it'll be probably fewer, but it'll take some time to level it out because both documents, the land use guidance and the regulatory tool, need to have some time to be placed on the ground. There needs to be intense education about how the two work together for the community and for the users, the developers. So there's a lot of education that we're planning as well as a part of that process. So it's definitely going to be some growing pains and some learning curves for everyone.
Yes, and that's why I think we need to be flexible. But I mean, also further to Ms. Johnson's point, if we do a good job on the map, a lot of development will be occurring by right. And that's why we're hoping that we have fewer rezonings, because we don't have this big disconnect between our maps and area plans and the current situation. But with that reduction in rezonings also comes an elimination of community meetings that would occur in the context of redevelopment. And I don't think that's simple. I don't think that you can actually generalize on how you change these land uses and not have a whole lot of issues that you ought to be thinking about concerning the neighbors. We're in sort of an unspecified place right now, I believe, legally on community benefit agreements and what their enforceability is. So the one thing we do not want to have happen is for us to streamline the process and to reduce the number of occasions on which rezoning is needed, but thereby exclude people who live nearby from the opportunity they used to have to attend a community meeting, come to a public hearing, and get us involved in what is being done near them. So I personally have a feeling that you're going to see quite a lot of rezoning activity as the map that you are creating is discovered by different people, and the implications of that map become clear to people who want to do development. But fine, we could deal with that as long as council, once it adopts that map, knows that that map can only be changed by an action of us, and that we're not, once we've adopted the map, we're not still in a mode where all kinds of changes could be happening to the map as a result of a staff action. And I think that's what I just heard you say. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just point out, I agree with Ms. Johnson that this issue of the community meeting and the means that residents have of speaking to us and engaging with us as development occurs is something that I expect we're going to have to deal with. And I just hope that as you pursue this further, that you'll be a little mindful of that. Thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Winston, and I just want to do a check. We're at 6:19 now, and I think we still have the code question come up. And so I just want to make sure if we can go through this round. And I have Mr. Winston. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on this?
Ms. Johnson has another question.
Ms. Johnson has another question. So Mr. Winston, followed by Ms. Johnson. Mr. Winston?
Thank you. I'll be quick. I've just got two quick comments. Thank you, Ms. Johnson, for bringing up the idea around the government channel and producing content for that. That's something that I remember came up about a year ago now when we were figuring out how to better engage with constituents around this very dense subject. And I know this pops up around different topics we discuss as well. When we think about transportation, when we think about the budget process. But I will tell you, from experience in the industry, that we are running the folks that we have working down there are really spread thin right now, as everything is virtual and everything is being broadcasted, which is a good thing. But in order to effectively do that, we're going to have to really invest in that space. That's something that if we're serious about it, we're going to have to deal with that in the budget process. And we're going to have to create the type of staffing and infrastructure that can support that. But on the other hand, we also would have to support planning in other departments with the type of creative staff that is necessary to produce the type of content that doesn't necessarily come cheap or easy, but I think it's a worthwhile thing to do. And I hope that this is something, Mr. Jones, that we can seriously consider from a specific, in relation specifically to the Comp 2040 plan implementation and all of the kind of pieces of that, but really hopefully take a more general look at how do we better use our abilities to produce content that can break down difficult and dense information in an effective way so we can disseminate those facts far and wide. Again, thinking about the regional aspect of things, our government channel is something that goes beyond the borders of Mecklenburg County, so that can be helpful in a couple other places. And again, something that Ms. Johnson, but other people have harped on, I was really struck by the yearly look back of this policy map, and planning staff. I think that is something that we should flesh out, and that should be kind of really right in the center of adoption, perhaps, as Ms. Johnson said, because for us, that's really where the rubber hits the road, right? Obviously, staff and planning professionals, that might not be the main meat on the bones, but that's how we do our job, right? That's how we work with the public, and that's how the public interacts with our government, is through these processes that everybody can plug into, and that knowledge is kind of constant. I think that type of a process really could alleviate some folks' fear of the unknown that is coming with this process. But I also think, for my colleagues and for my constituents out there, for us to remember that what we're dealing with are living documents, living policies, and really a living subject, right? We're dealing with growth of a city. So it should be obvious that what we plan for today, we might have to make different plans for in 12, 13, 14 years. But in order to do that in an effective manner, the public and us as elected officials need to know how to communicate people how to plug into that process and have confidence in that. So that yearly look back, I think, is that's the biggest takeaway I'm taking from today, and I hope that we can bring some more clarity through that as we go through this adoption process. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Winston. Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson? Did we lose her on the internet? I think Ms. Johnson, I don't know if you can hear us, but we've lost your visual on Zoom or WebEx. I think we're on WebEx. So, Ms. Johnson, if you can hear us, I think if you would just text Ms. Jackson, then that would be great, and then we'll keep going. Oh, there you are. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my computer just shut down. But I had a question about the slide presentation. If you can go back to the slide presentation with the percentages, the difference between pre-plan and the second phase. Yes, that one. Thank you. That's a great visual. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about the campus percentages. Can you clarify what I'm looking at, like currently, and what the proposed percentage for campus land use would be, please?
So there's 3 scenarios here. The first one is our adopted policies and what that campus place type would look like today. The first draft of the map shows the campus being 1.6%, which really recognized a lot of our schools and large universities and hospital campuses and those types of uses. And then in the second draft, we had to make some corrections because we included more school sites, smaller schools, but add them as campuses. So that's why we're still iterating what that percentage is. So if there was a neighborhood school, let's say possibly a Trinity, which is right up the street, we would code that as campus. But what we've heard from the community is that schools that are within a neighborhood should be envisioned more of a neighborhood type of feel and not a campus type of place type, which would be comparable to UNC Charlotte or Queens University. So we're still making some adjustments around the thresholds for that. So that's why you see such a significant increase from the first map to the second map. That second map included more of our smaller school sites. And so we're going to make some adjustments to those thresholds based on what we know, what we've heard from the community, and how they want to make sure that our neighborhood schools are recognized as part of the neighborhood fabric. If that makes sense.
It does. Thank you for that clarification. As the university representative, I saw that significant change and just wanted clarification.
Yeah.
So
you're welcome.
Okay. I think it has been a very productive discussion. I have to say that the work has come a long way, and how much we appreciate all the effort that the community residents are putting in and the staff is taking the time to walk through. We'll continue to hear this in our TAP committee and continue this process. So thanks, everyone. We're going to move to our next topic, which is a discussion of ordinances. And thank you, Mr. Newton, for joining us. I hope all is well. All right, on this topic, we're going to start with our city attorney. It's the city code update.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. I am here to discuss with you the criminal enforcement options as it relates to the city code. Back in December, I know I had some communications with all of you regarding what the city attorney's office, along with the administration, was doing in response to SB 300, which ultimately required the city, all cities, to look at our code of ordinances and make a specific determination as to which ordinances it would like to retain a civil or criminal authority to enforce, and which ones it did not. So I'm just going to go through a very quick review of the history of this process. Next slide, please. So again, how local governments enforce their ordinances are either civil enforcement or criminal enforcement. All the ordinances will be enforced, certainly at least civilly, and by civil enforcement, we're talking about issuing citations, assessing of fines, penalties, seeking court orders, essentially enforcement that doesn't ultimately result in a criminal charge. And the opposite would be criminal, which in our ordinances ends up being a Class 3 misdemeanor, which is at the infraction level. It doesn't require jail time, but ultimately there is a criminal conviction for a Class 3 misdemeanor and fines that can be a maximum of $500. Back in 2018, the General Assembly asked for all local governments to review their ordinances and to provide the General Assembly with information related to the ordinances in which they have, those individual local governments have chosen to enforce criminally as part and parcel of a very broad and expansive criminal justice reform study that occurred over the course of 2 years and ultimately came out with SB 300 was the final product that came out of that. Just want to remind council and the public that the vast majority of enforcement actions that the city takes with city code violations is civil in nature. that typically we start with seeking voluntary compliance for a violation of a particular ordinance, and we focus on civil work, but several ordinances we do enforce criminally, but the vast majority, just can't repeat that enough, is done in the civil nature. These city ordinances are not talking about violent crime issues or major fraud issues, robberies, murders, anything like that. Those are all state law issues that are handled at the state law level, and what SB 300 talked about did not relate to the enforcement of state laws. It only referred to the enforcement of civil ordinances in a criminal fashion. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip down. These are the sources of authority for cities to enforce both civil and criminal, but I want to skip down to the bottom of that, which is section 221 of the city code. I'd like to refer to this as the default criminal code provision. A lot of, most every local government has something to the effect that says, unless otherwise provided, any provision of the code may be criminally enforced. And this is specifically the item that the General Assembly was targeting, which is this idea that you've got a default criminal enforcement authority. What the General Assembly really wanted was for local governments to identify which of the ordinances they essentially wanted to continue to have criminal enforcement on, as opposed to a default provision, which essentially would say any of these code provisions could be enforced criminally. The focus, again, was to not over-criminalize all of the ordinances that are there, for local governments to be very specific about which ordinances they wanted to continue to have criminal enforcement. So we move forward to next slide, please. Where we are now, this is a new SB 300 was what ultimately came out of this entire process. And what SB 300 did was it eliminated, again, that default penalty of criminal enforcement. Local governments have to be specific if you want to criminally enforce your ordinances. It also deprived local governments of the ability to criminally enforce ordinances in 10 areas of regulation that I'll go over with you shortly. This process, and this is the first step of at a minimum two-step process, it could be more steps, where we have to introduce what we would like to continue to have criminal enforcement, and then at a subsequent meeting is when the council would pass whatever amendments are being put in front of the council, or whatever amendments the council desires, again, in terms of which of the ordinances it would like to continue to enforce criminally. Again, this is part of a much broader criminal justice and reform package, and I want to highlight those last three bullets at the bottom there to tell you really what the tenor of this entire package was. A big focus was to not criminalize poverty. So a number of the actually statutory defenses to some of the criminal prosecutions that can occur in a municipal ordinance includes situations where individuals are trying to address their unemployment or homelessness situation, or situations where individuals are suffering from mental health or substance abuse issues. If there is evidence that they are suffering from mental health or substance abuse issues, again, related just to these city ordinances, that can be a defense, and the focus then shifts to getting them help for their issues rather than criminalizing their activity when they're suffering under unemployment, homelessness, mental health, or substance abuse. Another aspect of this particular law is that if you are charged criminally with one of these ordinances that the City Council determines should remain to have the option of criminal enforcement, if you haven't engaged in or not been cited by the violation within 30 days of the first time you've been cited with a violation, then that can be a defense to potentially get your charges dismissed. So I just want to give council a general tone of what the General Assembly was trying to do. It's often been referred to as decriminalizing city ordinances, but there's definitely a push toward not having so many ordinances that local governments have to potentially have a criminal impact. Next slide, please. So these are the lists, this is the statutory list now of ordinances that local governments can no longer criminally enforce. And you see there businesses and trades, a lot of these issues are permitting related as opposed to specific things, again, violence or something like that. That's not what we're talking about, but a lot of these areas relate to permits, having permits for certain things, vehicle for hire, what have you. And this is the list on page, yes, on this particular slide that we no longer have the authority to criminally enforce. The asterisk that you see there are ordinances that are probably going to be, are more likely going to be combined into our UDO, and we don't have those in front of you tonight. Those will be handled through the Unified Development Ordinance process. Next slide, please. The next two slides that we have are the statutes that we would like to continue to simply civilly enforce and not have criminal enforcement associated with them. Again, keep in mind that default provision that says that everything in the code can be criminally enforced goes away as this statute has been enacted. So we're in the process now, and what we've been doing for the last 2 months is literally reviewing every ordinance in the code to determine which ordinances have we typically used criminal enforcement. And again, keep in mind, I just want to reiterate, the vast majority of what we do is civil in nature, but we identified those ordinances that we have used criminal enforcement and those ordinances that we would like to at least retain the ability to criminally enforce going forward. The list on the next, on slides 6 and 7 are the ordinances, and these are the chapters of the ordinances that the city administration is proposing that we only focus on civil enforcement and not either retain or add the ability to criminally enforce going forward. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn slides 8 and 9 over to Deputy City Attorney Lena James. These are the ordinances that the administration would like to retain the ability to criminally enforce. Ms. James.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, managers. Thank you, Mr. Baker. I'll pick up and try to go quickly through this topic that I know is not very riveting on Valentine's Day. But as we go to slide number 8, you have a list of the ordinances. And again, just for ease of reference, we have the chapters in the code and the name, the sections specifically where we are proposing to reinstate or restore what we call options for criminal enforcement. Again, as Mr. Baker said, this would be our last resort, so to speak. We would usually use other tools and other measures before seeking criminal enforcement. I won't go through the whole list, but I will tell you that, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank at least a team of 10 attorneys who have been working with us very much on going through this process. We started it a couple of months ago, as Mr. Baker said, and so we have this group of folks who've been working with the different client departments to help you identify which sections within each chapter we really believe we need to have that ability for criminal enforcement. And so those are the sections that you see on this list divided by the chapters in specific areas. For some of the areas where we have bolded it, it's just to give you examples of areas where we're looking for those kinds of offenses or violations of the code where we would want to have that option. If you have specific questions on some of those as we go particularly to slide 9, happy to answer those, but I think they speak for themselves, and I think particularly the police department can tell you about the ones that you see on slide 9 with reference to when there might be a gap in state law, and police believes we might need an option to have one of these violations as a basis to issue a citation or a criminal charge. Slide 10 simply just summarizes the reasons why, and I know we've had a number of questions from folks about, what are the typical civil measures or civil tools that the city uses? And again, as you'll see, I think similar to what we did when we went into a state of emergency a couple years ago, the city always starts with education and an attempt to try to obtain voluntary compliance. I think most offenses in our experience, or most violations of the city code, you usually have compliance. If education doesn't work, if voluntary compliance doesn't work, then the city has the tools of civil citations, notices of violations, stop orders, all manner of things, and in addition to the right to issue civil fines and citations. It's when those tools fail that we say we ought to be able to have this in these particular areas. Again, the areas on slide 9 and 10. To the extent somebody is charged with a criminal offense, the prosecution would be through the district attorney's office. They do what they call environmental court, which is where simply for city code violations, and I think most cities across the state have something comparable where the district attorney's office then prosecutes for the criminal offense. And again, the objective with having the option of criminal enforcement is to reduce or minimize those continuing violations and have an opportunity to get something that is a nuisance or some bad action to stop, for lack of a better word. I will pause there and let Mr. Baker wrap it up with the last slide, slide 11, and then happy to answer any questions.
And essentially what we are asking for council right now is to review the proposed amendments that we've brought to you, and that is specifically to retain criminal enforcement ability in the areas, specifically the sections that are included in sections 8 and 9. These are the areas that, again, we would like to retain that criminal enforcement, and are areas that we have used criminal enforcement in the past. But again, want to reiterate and emphasize that criminal enforcement is the last resort in these situations. We try to get voluntary compliance or go through the civil route when it's available, but sometimes, and these are more the high-profile matters that we can still criminally enforce that are here in front of you that don't necessarily have an equivalent civil or state law remedy going forward. So we'd like for you to review what we've put in front of you on slides 8 and 9. We do have folks from the administration, specific departments that enforce these areas here to answer any questions that you have. What we would intend to do is, if the council was satisfied, or when the council gets satisfied as to which ordinances it would like to retain the ability to criminally enforce, we'd bring those ordinances and any adjustments that we would have to make to you for you to pass. And we can do that as early as your February 28th council meeting. We don't have to have a specific public hearing on these, simply need to have council's assent to continue to have criminal prosecution in these fairly limited areas. I'm happy to take any questions. And again, staff is here if you have very specific questions about some of these ordinances.
So I'm going to try to say what you said, Mr. Baker, is that if the council approves this recommendation to the staff, then you will come back on February 28th with council action. So we're looking at, are there any exceptions to the staff's recommendation or any changes to the staff recommendation that you have? And then we would treat those accordingly. So with that, I believe I have Ms. Ajmira to start us off. Ms. Ajmira?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Baker and Ms. James, thank you so much for your work on this. Going through so many ordinances requires a lot of time and effort, so I appreciate you and your team's work here, specifically while addressing that we don't criminalize poverty in our city. That is important. A couple of questions. Do we have any data? I appreciate the recommendations here. What I'm looking for is how many times we have enforced criminal charge for a specific area. I think having data would really help. I know Mr. Baker had mentioned earlier that it's majority of it's civil, but I would like to know the areas where we have had to use criminal charge and how many times, just to gather some data. Would that be possible, Mr. Baker or Ms. James?
We should be able to pull that information for you. I can tell you that I did get some information from the police department that from 12/1/2020 to 11/30/2021, we used criminal charges in 191 cases. But I don't have the amount of, and when we talk about civil enforcement, that can be a situation where we seek voluntary compliance. We tell someone to turn the music down or whatever the noisemaker is going on. So I don't have the number of times that we've used civil enforcement, but the vast majority of those 191 cases that occurred in 2021, 122 of them were discharging firearms in the city, which we're proposing that we retain the ability to criminally enforce. The second most was 21 cases of possession of firearms on city property, which again we've continued to maintain needs the ability to criminally enforce. And the third highest at 15 was loitering for drug activity. That one's a little bit more complicated because oftentimes there's a state law prohibition that's involved in that as well. So I don't know that we've had 15 times where we just cited on that particular issue, but it's quite possible that that was included with other state violations. All the other violations are less than 10. So that just gives you an idea of what we're criminally enforcing for that one particular year. But we'll see if we can pull some more statistics for you, because I think that's important for you all to have a clear understanding as you make this decision.
Yes, I think that would be very helpful, along with a description, like for example, discharging firearm. Definitely, we do need to provide CMPD that option to criminally charge someone. I think that is something very important where we have gun violence issue in our city. So I would like to just get data on that, maybe over the past couple of years, so we get an idea about where we definitely need criminal charge. And why we need it. Other thing on the noise ordinance, I wasn't, can you go back to slide number 9 where it shows the areas where recommendations are for criminal charge? Okay. So for this one, we do have noise. So I know we have gotten complaints over past, and that's an ongoing issue with the health access to healthcare services for women. Have we ever charged anyone with criminal charge for harassing an individual from accessing healthcare services?
I'm not sure specifically what the charge was, but I know that we have used the noise ordinance in some of those picketing areas where it's the amplified sound was the issue that we had going forward. Even in that situation, the vast majority of the ordinance enforcement was civil, but I am certain that it's happened at least once. Maybe twice, not very often. Most of the times it's that we're asking for voluntary compliance, which we typically get.
Okay. All right, well, I look forward to that, and thank you so much.
All right, Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Mayor. Just quickly, didn't we used to have the authority to impose jail sentences of up to 30 days? Has that gone away?
I'm not sure about that. I know with the misdemeanor, it is the jail sentence is not available to us, but it's possible that at some point in time in the past, we may have had that.
But you don't think we do now?
I don't believe so.
And basically, what you just told us, you're asking us in essence to vote on it tonight?
No. In fact, the statute specifically says you can't vote on it tonight. We can introduce it to you, and if you have questions or, as Ms. Ajmira asked, for more data, we can provide that to you. But the earliest we would bring something back to you to vote would be February the 28th. And if there was a particular ordinance, particularly in slides 8 and 9, that you have concerns about or want more information about in terms of whether you agree with us that these particular ordinances should retain the criminal enforcement ability. That's the information that we'd like to get from you tonight. But really, any time between now and the 28th would be good. But no, we're not asking you to vote on anything tonight.
So you would like a sort of a nod from us to proceed tonight, but we're not finalizing it.
That would be helpful, and if you've got concerns about anything specific, we'd like to know that sooner rather than later.
I think, Mr. Driggs, especially the ones that you may say, I have a question about whether we should do this. So by exception, I think looking at the list, is there one that you would like to pull out for more information or more data? But I think it's really important to kind of identify those that you want the attorney's office to bring back more information, or you have questions about why we're doing.
All right, I'd just like a little more time to look at these and maybe get in touch with the attorney in the next couple of days if I have any questions. I do have a question now, Mr. Baker. Would you characterize this whole process as kind of reducing our authority to maintain order in the city, or how does it impact our overall kind of police powers and law enforcement?
Well, it definitely curbs the ability to use criminal enforcement. And I think that was really, interestingly enough, a fairly bipartisan group of state legislators that came together with the idea that having that default everything is potentially criminally enforced was not a good idea, and that some local governments were using it maybe more in ways that weren't as equitable as others. And I think that's where they really wanted councils, and oftentimes this is the first process that I've been aware of where a council has done an exhaustive review. Now, we've done it kind of for you, but you could you can dig into it for a couple of months if you'd like to as well. But this is really the first time in my career that we've initiated a complete exhaustive review of the entire city code to determine, okay, which one of these ordinances really needs to have criminal enforcement going forward.
Do you have any indication that it was Charlotte in particular that prompted this action on their part, or do we know anything about that?
I don't know what prompted it. This really started coming out, I think in 2017 was when the study commission was put out there. But I know that nationwide there's been concerns about local governments using their city ordinances to essentially build their add to their general fund with the expectation that they were going to be citing folks criminally and getting money from that. And I know that nationwide is an area of concern and that the state legislature here has asked local governments to look at.
And last quick question, are there any examples where an offense that is a civil offense initially, if repeated over and over again, can become a criminal offense?
Not unless we specifically state that that's going to be the case. And by then, again, some of these ordinances on page 8 and 9 haven't had the ability to, well, we haven't used criminal enforcement in a while on those. So you've got a group where we'd like to at least retain the ability because of the nature of the particular ordinance violation, and that could address some of those situations where normally we wouldn't use criminal enforcement, but if we're seeing someone doing it over and over and over again and they're just not listening to us, whether it's attacking animals or the noise ordinance or what have you, these are areas, these quality of life areas where an absolute abuse of the process could justify using a criminal enforcement as a higher level of punishment, and that's why in a number of these situations we've asked for that authority.
Right, because for a lot of people, the fines that we're able to assess would be a very minor cost of business, and if there wasn't anything more that we had that we could throw at them, in a commercial sense, they might just ignore us, right? Just write the check and say, okay.
Correct.
It's like a utility bill. Anyway, thank you, Patrick.
All right, Mr. Winston.
Yeah, thank you for this work from the attorney's office. As they mentioned, they did the exhaustive work for us by going through all of our code and kind of whittling it down to this list. But I would question question if that's enough, since these are ordinances that are in fact adopted by council and considered by council. I feel like we should be going line through these this whittled down list. You know, I'm wondering why we would not refer this to two committees. One, the Safe Communities Committee, so that we can have a robust discussion about whether or not criminal enforcement of this list that the attorneys are presenting actually does help us keep our community safe. And then the equity, the Triple E Committee. As this effort was started on the state level, and as Mr. Baker stated, on the national level, from concerns about equitable distribution of enforcement of civil and or criminal codes. This slide right here, for instance, there are two things that I would ask to look at from an equity perspective, if they can be enforced on a criminal perspective on an equitable basis, and that would be, just for example, youth protections of curfew violations. Is that going to be the same as parts of District 7 as it is in parts of District 2? How do we think about those things, when we make these decisions? And camping on city property, we know how those things can be used subjectively to deal with certain types of civil discourse. So I don't think it should be as simple as the attorney's office presenting us something to vote on the 28th. I think there's a lot here that council should do its work and be given a venue and time to go through this line by line. I know I would love to spend time by myself with the attorneys doing this, and perhaps if a combination of individual meetings, group meetings, and or committee meetings, we can get through this in the next couple months. But I certainly wouldn't want to rush through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Mayor. Can we go back to the slide where you talked about the mitigation of the charges if they were seeking treatment for mental health or they were unemployed?
Yes, that is slide 4.
Okay. So just explain the last bullet for me again, please.
So the statute, it's codified in the statute that there are certain defenses that could be valid defenses against a criminal charge. That is, it could be the subject of a dismissal of a charge. And again, this is a new statute, so we haven't really gone through it. It is brand new, but they specifically carved out if an individual is working to address unemployment issues, homelessness, mental health, or substance abuse. And I know, for instance, the homelessness piece that may in part, particularly if you've decided to sleep on a public bench or something along those lines, that is a violation of the ordinance, or camping, if you will, that could be the type of thing where if you're homelessness, it doesn't necessarily give you the now reason to be able to violate the ordinance, but it could be a defense to a criminal charge of violating the ordinance. And keep in mind, the bullet above talks about no new violations within 30 days of the first violation. So using that example, if you were charged with camping on public property and then you went away from that, you weren't camping any longer, that could be a defense to a charge going forward. Ms. James, do you have anything to add to that?
Simply just to clarify, so it's adding, there was a criminal statute that's critical here, and I think it's on one of your earlier slides, 14-4. So what these two new defenses is adding a subsection to that statute, which is in the criminal code of the state statutes, not the city code. And it simply is allowing I think, aligning with that public policy intent of reducing the criminalization of poverty. And so it allows these defenses, as somebody who's charged with a criminal offense may be able to assert if they are being prosecuted, if they were in court for this, that they were either, working in good faith to address one of those underlying conditions, or that they have been cited once already in the last 30 days. So I just wanted to provide that context.
So thank you for that. And I, as an advocate, I just have to say that, statistics show that 1 in 2 homeless individuals have possibly some history of a head injury. And there's a study by the University of Denver where 96% of the inmates that they studied in their sample had a history of a head injury. So as a brain injury advocate, and also as an advocate for individuals with disabilities and who suffer from mental illness, I really want to take a look at this bullet. And if Council Member Winston wants to really get down in the weeds with this policy, I'm game, because I think this is a policy that we really have to consider what this means. So in North Carolina, Medicaid is not expanded. So there are many people that are walking around who don't have access to mental health treatment or substance abuse treatment, or if there are clinics that are out there, they may need case management or support in finding those resources. The same with employment. And if I'm sleeping on a bench at night because I don't have a place to live, or I'm having a mental health episode, there's a likelihood that I might sleep on the bench tomorrow or the next day. So I think that we really want to take a look at the process. And I don't know if we could work with an organization, perhaps, if we're looking at decriminalizing mental health and poverty, if we could look at an organization that could provide wraparound services, perhaps referral to that agency, to actually work with individuals, if it truly is a matter of mental health or something where a person needs treatment and not criminalization, which just magnifies the problem. If a person has, mental health and not getting their treatment, and then they have a criminal record, I mean, just the downward spiral and the cycle that it leads to. So of course, I appreciate this, and I think it's awesome and necessary in the approach to criminal justice reform. But I think that I want to see this be more than words on a document, and really implementing the practices and the tools to really make a difference for individuals that might need this mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Okay, so as I said, the staff has made a recommendation. I think that Mr. Winston has suggested that the staff work with council in one of the formats that he suggested to review this in more detail. And then I think Ms. Johnson agreed on that approach to see something more than just what's recommended before the 28th. So I guess the question is for the council to give some guidance to us for all of this. And I guess I'm going to ask the question of Mr. Baker. What would be the impact of 3-month delay?
So there really isn't. If there are certain elements that you would like to go ahead and move forward, for instance, I know the one that hit my inbox the most in December was the noise ordinance. Now, the noise ordinance does already have very specific criminal penalties attached to it, but if that was something that you weren't interested in removing the criminal penalties from, that would be something that we could bring to you and just go ahead and give that assurance to the police officers. Because what we didn't want to do was to tell the police officers you can enforce certain ones, but don't enforce all of them. And that's why we took the approach of let's just go through everything and do it all at once. But if something like the noise ordinance, particularly the discharging firearms in the city and possession of firearms on city property. For those, I would certainly recommend that we go ahead and make that clear that we want to retain, unless there was a move among council to not do that. And we can take a look at the list and at least call some of the big ones out. The more, I won't call them more important. They're all important, but the ones that get the most in terms of citizen interaction and concern, we can pull those out and bring those to you.
I wonder if it might be possible for you to identify those in the next week
We can.
that really do have to do with violence and guns and things like that. And then for the others that Ms. Johnson and Mr. Winston have called into question, to have a conversation around that with the staff and see how that might be referred to the Safe Communities Committee or the Great Neighborhoods Committee. We'll figure that out based upon a meeting we have later on this week, and we'll go from there. Is that acceptable to the council?
Well, Mayor, can I
Just a
clarify
question.
what?
Can I get Mr. Graham first, since he hasn't spoken yet, and then we'll go Ms. Mayor Pro Tem, and then we'll come back to people that have spoken already on the item. Mr. Graham?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I guess I'm talking to the attorney. A lot of the sourcing has already been done, though, in terms of the attorneys actually kind of getting in the weeds and pulling those weeds out. And what we have in front of us is what you think are those items that we are to pay close attention to?
Yes, this is the vast majority of the ordinances we're saying we don't need to criminally enforce.
Yeah, and
this probably represents maybe.
And I agree with the mayor that those items that are first of mine, which are probably slide 9, I just don't want us to get in the weeds, right? But I'll defer to my colleagues. But it seems like a lot of the work has already been done. But I'll defer to hear the rest of the debate.
Yes, let's have the council look particularly at page on slide 9, offenses and miscellaneous shooting, possession, state of emergency, noise. Those are some of the things that perhaps, but I think the question on some of the others are different. So, all right, Mayor Pro Tem?
Just to maybe say it a little bit differently, I think it might be, what if Mr. Winston and Ms. Johnson work with staff specifically on the ones that are of concern to them, and then if there is a different process that they'd like to see based on the outcome of those discussions, they could bring it back to council. Because the list is long, we've got a lot to do, and let's focus on the ones that are important and do impact people most directly, such as what Ms. Johnson brought up. But I don't know that we should be bringing all of this back to committee right now if in fact, a good portion of it is going to be categorized as it is now. I like the fact that some of the violations could go from civil to criminal for the individuals that are intentionally trying to do harm versus making a mistake or, it just happens and there's civil violations because of that. That's a big difference between criminal and civil, right? So I would just like to suggest that council members who've got issues with specific things work with staff, and then if it needs to come to council, share it in an email. Let's do some of the work behind this, not behind the scenes, but do some of the work outside of this format right now to get more information, and then share it with everybody, what you've learned, if it differs from what's being presented.
Mayor Pro Tem, I think that's a really good suggestion as well. I think that usually when we designate and someone volunteers to do it and they are actively engaged, then that's great. So before, I think we have to get Ms. Johnson and Mr. Winston to agree that that's what they would like to do, and if anyone else cares to join them, they could raise their hand. But I don't want to impose a decision that I'm assuming that they would volunteer. So with that, I think I had Ms. Johnson next.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I did not want to propose that we delay this. I'm simply saying I just think that we do need to really get more into the weeds, at least on that process. So I just want to make sure that we're looking at it. But I was not recommending that we defer this any longer. To piggyback off what Mayor Pro Tem is saying, she's saying that we go ahead and vote on it next week, and then we work behind the scenes with the attorneys to tweak the process or really ask the questions and share ideas, because I'm willing to do that as well. It's kind of like implementing and then developing an implementation strategy. So I'm certainly willing to do that. Also willing to, step back and if it goes to the committee. But I'd like to see this implemented if that's what the attorneys are recommending. But I'm certainly willing to do the work ongoing.
Can I just make a clarification?
Okay.
The vote is for the end of for the 28th, so that's 2 weeks. So, because next week is zoning, so it gives a little bit more time to have that conversation before the vote comes up.
Okay. Yeah, I support that.
All right, Mr. Winston, how about?
Because again, we can implement it, and then if there's more work to be done, we can work on the strategies and perfecting it and tweaking it ongoing.
So far, what we have is Mr. Winston and Ms. Johnson working with the city attorney, but we wouldn't delay this. It would still come back on the 28th, and that you could provide some more guidance and more thoughtfulness and say, how do you proceed further? I think that's what Ms. Johnson is saying, to make sure things are rolling the way that we intend it to. But I may be overstretching that. I just don't want to do that.
I'm willing to do that. I can't speak for Mr. Winston, but I mean, this is what I do. This is who I am, and advocating for criminal justice and mental illness and all of that. So I'm happy to be a part of the team. Thanks.
Mr. Phipps, do you mind if Mr. Winston makes a comment before you help, or do you want to provide a comment now?
He can go ahead.
All right, Mr. Winston, how do you feel about you and Ms. Johnson?
I mean, I am only talking about getting into the weeds. I certainly do want to get into the weeds of the items that the attorneys are suggesting that we restore criminal enforcement on. I will certainly speak to the attorneys on my own. I mean, that's something I do regularly. I just was suggesting that we might consider having a public conversation about this in the appropriate workflows that we do have. But if council doesn't want to have a public discussion about these recommendations and adopting these recommendations, that's up to council. But I'm certainly going to talk to the attorneys and other colleagues on our own, behind the scenes, or on emails or texts or phone calls.
They certainly will be public conversations. So you have these public conversations, and the city attorney would be reporting back. But I think Mr. Baker had a comment.
Yeah, it's actually possible to do both. In fact, I would recommend that we do both, because keep in mind that up until December the 1st of last year, you've always had the ability to do both criminal and civil enforcement. Now you have to say specifically that you want to have criminal enforcement. So what you could do, again, unless there's an objection to any of what we've proposed to you, you could adopt that on the 28th, and then we can still have that level of discussion to determine whether or not that's your final answer. And if council decides that, you know, there might be one or two that we want to take off the list, we can always come back and do that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baker. All right, we have a plan so far that Mr. Baker says we do both. We go ahead and implement, and then we track and follow. Mr. Phipps?
Yeah, I wanted to call out on slide 9, the fact that you have some ordinances that are applicable based on whether or not it's within the city limits, whether or not it's on city property, or whether or not it's on public property. So what about those instances where, you know, like we had Tent City? I think some of those tents were on property owned by NCDOT. So are we saying that because that property ownership lies with them, that even though it's within the city limits, we have no authority to exercise any kind of penalties?
Mr. Baker?
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying, but that could be a situation where if the property owner, not the city, but a private property owner or even DOT requests that someone leave the property, that could subject them to trespass, which I believe is also there was a state law provision there, and it's quite possible that you wouldn't need a city ordinance to enforce a criminal trespass.
So it seems sort of confusing. So as it pertains to nuisance type activity like litter, are you saying then that there's a carve out for panhandlers or whatever that contribute to litter, but because they could use that as a possible excuse, that they are somehow would be an acceptable defense for them?
Yeah, it's really, I don't want to get too far into these new defenses that have been put together by SB 300 because they've not been tested before. And again, this is an ordinance or a statute that's only a few weeks old. I suspect that the case law will develop over the course of time. So I'm not saying that simply because you're homeless means that you can violate all the statutes of the city. Or all the ordinances of the city repeatedly and just have that as an excuse. It's a potential defense because the General Assembly was particularly concerned about local governments essentially criminalizing poverty, but it just hasn't developed yet to where we're allowing a class of folks to ignore all the ordinances and that they've got a built-in defense. That was not the intent of the General Assembly.
Thank you.
Mr. Winston?
I have no further comment or question.
Okay, thank you very much. So I believe that what we have is an agreement for the city attorney to continue as the staff recommendation, come back to us on the 28th and having a conversation with Ms. Johnson and Mr. Winston on how this might be best handled both short and long term.
Absolutely.
Is everybody good? All right, so I think that's our last item on the action review for today. We do not have a closed session. And so before we go into our regular business meeting, I would like to take a moment to express the City Council and Mayor's deepest condolence to the family of Ethan Rivera, a CATS driver who was shot and killed in the line of duty over this weekend. Mr. Rivera was a public servant and had been a part of the CATS family for just over 1 year. He came to us during the height of the pandemic, and when many people were leaving the workforce, he stepped up and came to work for us. I want you to know that he was a father, a brother, and a son. On Friday night, when many of our residents were enjoying the night out with friends and family, Mr. Rivera was serving our city by providing a much-needed and very valuable service to our residents, the ability to be on transit. Mr. Rivera, like all of our CATS drivers, was proud to provide his riders with a way to get to work affordably and to get to the grocery store, to make medical appointments, pick up prescriptions. He was proud of his job and getting people where they needed to go. You know, since the pandemic began, we use the term essential worker a lot. Mr. Rivera truly was an essential worker in this community, and by all accounts, he was well respected and appreciated by those who rode on a daily basis with him. I ask all of you tonight to join me in prayers for Mr. Rivera's family. There's nothing we can ever do or say to lessen the pain that they're feeling tonight, but I want them to know that their father, husband, and brother served the city with honor and pride, and I am proud, along with the Charlotte City Council. We are grateful that he was a member of our CATS team. And this unfortunate accident, this unfortunate loss of life is still being investigated. And we hope that we will bring someone to justice and peace will be found and a resolution on the loss of Mr. Rivera. So it's always difficult when we lose a member of our community, and we truly are a community, and especially a community that's been serving us so well during the time of this pandemic. So to the Rivera family, our deepest regrets, and we're with you. So with that, we will now turn to the remaining items on our agenda for tonight. And those items begin with a public hearing on a resolution to close Ormond Court off of Sloan Street. Do we have any speakers? No speakers?
Motion to close the public hearing.
Second, Driggs.
All right, thank you. And we have a motion to adopt. Is that the same combined motion, Mr. Eggleston?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Eggleston and Mr. Driggs, thank you very much. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, Ms. Watlington?
Yes.
Ms. Watlington, where are you? Can you get us on camera for your vote? Is that correct, Mr. Baker? Yes. All right. We'll keep going, and then we'll come back to Ms. Watlington. Mayor
I'm sorry. My thing keeps going back and forth. Can you see me?
No, we can't see you.
Can you see me?
There, no. Well,
I see me.
I see you now. Thank you very much. Ms. Watlington is recorded as yes. Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes.
Ms. Ajmira?
Yes.
Mr. Phipps?
Yes.
Mr. Winston?
Yes.
Mr. Bakari?
Yes.
Mr. Driggs?
Yes.
Mr. Eggleston?
Yes.
Mr. Graham? Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
City Manager, do you have a report tonight? We have no report from the City Manager tonight. So we'll now go to our business items. The item 8 is authorize the City Manager to negotiate and execute any necessary contracts and agreements related to the COVID virus state and local fiscal recovery fund by the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 for the following investment recommendations. Up to $14 million for small business, workforce, and hospitality support. Up to $2.5 million for a small business partner support program, up to $2.5 million for a small business innovation grant program, up to $3 million to implement recommendations associated with the employment study for the city's corridors of opportunity, up to $500,000 for the renewable energy and energy efficiency training program, up to $1.5 million for a workforce partner support program, up to $4 million for the Charlotte Regional Visitors Authority for the hospitality sector support, up to $3.5 million for nonprofit operating grants, and up to $1.5 million in operating support for a local foods production and distribution facility. Do I have a motion?
So move.
Motion to authorize.
We have a motion.
Second, Ajmira.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? We had all of these presented last week, and there was a lengthy discussion on them, but are there any discussions or comments? Hearing none, we'll have a roll call vote to adopt and approve. Mr. Newton?
Yes.
Ms. Watlington?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem,
Yes.
Ms. Ajmira,
Yes.
Mr. Phipps,
Yes.
Mr. Winston,
Yes.
Mr. Bakari,
Yes.
Mr. Driggs,
Yes.
Mr. Eggleston,
Yes.
Mr. Graham,
Yes.
Ms. Johnson.
Yes.
That motion passes unanimously, and I'm really glad to see the ARPA money coming out of Washington going into the hands of our community. The next item is to authorize the city manager and staff to work with recommended affordable housing developers to finalize preliminary affordable housing proposals and negotiate conveyance of 4 vacant city-owned properties for the development of affordable housing as follows. 11217 Providence Road West, conveyance to Crosland Southeast. The next item is 1654 Newland Road, conveyance to Habitat for Humanity of the Charlotte region. 7605 University City Boulevard, conveyance to Dream Key Partners and Conifer Realty. And the last item, 7204 and 7202 South Boulevard, conveyance to the NRP Group. Do I
Motion to
have
authorize.
a motion? We have a motion.
Second.
And a second. We also had a presentation on all of this, and we had a long, lengthy discussion. So is there any discussion or comment on these? Hearing none, we'll have a roll call vote. Mr. Newton?
Mayor,
I'm sorry.
Ms. Johnson.
Ms. Johnson?
I'm sorry, I didn't have time to text.
Okay.
We asked some questions last week about the formulas and about the conveyance. Is there anyone to speak on that tonight?
We received a report, and it's a follow-up to the February 7th session. It talks about the questions were addressed. The first one was, are LIHTC dollars available for home ownership? And I'll just read the report. It should be in your email box, Ms. Johnson, or sent out in, I think, a council packet this sometime last week. But the first one was that know that low-income LIHTC dollars could not be used for home ownership. And then I believe your question, Ms. Johnson, was what is the standard formula for a LIHTC project? If these are city land conveyances, I think the percentages should be great or different to allow the city to leverage our land to get what we need for the most vulnerable because the developer is saving money. The response is, while there's no standard median income mix for LIHTC projects, there are requirements that LIHTC developers must meet. To qualify for a 9% tax credit through LIHTC, developments must target 25% of the units to households at 30% AMI with an eligible income cap of 80% AMI. To qualify for a 4% tax credit through LIHTC, the average AMI for the entire development must be 60% or below. The city-supported developments, a minimum of 20% of the units must be available for 30 or below. And it's a document, it's titled Housing Initiatives 2022, and it was sent, it's the follow-up from the questions on February the 7th.
And not the email that was sent at 3:46 today? Something
No,
else?
no.
Okay. So my question, are we requiring a higher percentage for our most vulnerable residents since we are either giving the land to the developer or selling it at a nominal price? Are we requiring more from these developers since we are giving them the benefits of the land? I think that's very appropriate for us to do. It's a win-win situation. So am I understanding this correctly, that the developers are getting this land from the city? It will belong to them at a minimal or nominal price or free. I don't know what the details are. We didn't have them last week. I think that if we're going to do that, this is our opportunity to ask for more for our hardest to house.
All right, I read very quickly. Ms. Johnson, I'm going to have Sean Heath come in because he also has an answer to that on that document that was sent out, but I'm going to let him take it from here.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Sean Heath from the City Manager's Office. Just quickly a reminder that what we've contemplated here is a two-step process. So tonight is really the intermediate step where we're seeking council authority for staff to move forward with negotiations, with the second and final step being the final resolutions themselves, which would have all of the negotiated details that you've expressed interest in, Councilmember Johnson. And back to the conversation from last week where we discussed a little bit the whole notion of ensuring through the conveyance of city-owned land that we're finding a value proposition of interest to the city through affordability terms, through number of affordable housing units, through the AMI mix, et cetera. So those are just the sorts of things that we'll be working through in the negotiation process. Tonight's vote is just giving us the ability to move forward with the negotiation, not to execute the deals themselves.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. And again, I would just say if they're required for LIHTC at either 20 or 25%, whatever the percentage is, you know, for 30% AMI, if we are reducing their debt and we're giving them the land or giving it to them at a much lower price, I think this is an opportunity for the city to raise the bar or to raise the expectation for our most vulnerable citizens. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Johnson. All right, any further discussion or comment? Okay, Ms. Johnson, I'll ask Ms. Jackson to get you another copy of that presentation that went out earlier, just in case it didn't get in the right place for you. Okay?
Thank you.
All right, we'll start off with Mr. Newton.
Yes.
Ms. Watlington?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes.
Ms. Ajmira?
Yes.
Mr. Phipps?
Yes.
Mr. Winston?
Yes.
Mr. Bakari?
Yes.
Mr. Driggs?
Yes.
Mr. Eggleston?
Yes.
Mr. Graham? Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
All right. The next item is to adopt a resolution accepting the highest qualifying bid to purchase a portion of land containing approximately 0.8 of an acre for the future right-of-way improvements for a temporary grading easement from the 130-acre city-owned parcel located along Dixie River Road, and to authorize the manager to negotiate and execute all documents necessary for this action. Do I have a motion?
So moved, Driggs.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion. Mr. Newton, we're going to start the vote.
Yes.
Right now, let's.
Ms. Watlington?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes.
Ms. Ajmira?
Yes.
Mr. Phipps?
Yes.
Mr. Winston?
Yes.
Mr. Bakari?
Yes.
Mr. Driggs?
Yes.
Mr. Eggleston?
Yes.
Mr. Graham? Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
The next item is to adopt a budget ordinance appropriating $915,000 in private development funds from Pringle Square LLC for the Brown Greer Road widening project to the General Capital Projects Fund. Do I have a motion?
Moved. Isel.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, we'll start our voting. Mr. Newton?
Yes.
Ms. Watlington?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes.
Ms. Ajmira?
Yes.
Mr. Phipps?
Yes.
Mr. Winston?
Yes.
Mr. Bakari?
Yes.
Mr. Driggs?
Yes.
Mr. Eggleston?
Yes.
Mr. Graham? Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
All right. Tonight, the City Council, our last action of the night, The City Council will also consider nominations to various boards and commissions. The council members have submitted their nominations earlier to the clerk by email. Names of the nominees will not be read tonight. Tomorrow, the clerk will email the members of council the names of applicants that have received at least 2 nominations. These candidates will be considered for appointment at the next business meeting. Any applicant receiving 6 or more nominations can be considered for appointment tonight upon a motion, second, and a majority vote. The names of all nominees will be recorded in the official minutes of the meeting. The clerk will now proceed with announcing the results of the nominations.
Thank you, Mayor. For the Bicycle Advisory Committee, well, first, I might say that there are several boards that the individuals received 6 or more nominations. So at the conclusion, if council desires to do so, a motion to appoint those persons would be in order, a motion of second and a vote. For the Bicycle Advisory Committee, we will bring those back to you at your February 28th meeting. For the Business Advisory Committee, there were no recommendations or applications available for consideration at this time. For the Charlotte Business Inclusion Advisory Committee, for the 2 appointments for a 2-year term, the incumbents Vernetta Mitchell and Stephanie Moore-Han both received 9 nominations, and both are incumbents. For the at-large representative of a prime construction company, there were no recommendations or applications. For the 1 appointment for a 2-year term by the Black Chamber of Commerce, the incumbent Harrison Williams received 9 nominations. For the 2-year term recommended by the Carolina Asian American Chamber of Commerce, the incumbent Alex Bowie received 9 nominations. For the Hispanic Contractors Association, there were no recommendations or applications received. For the recommendation by the Latin American Chamber of Commerce, the incumbent Bailey received 9 nominations. For the Metrolina Minority Contractors Association, the incumbent Valerie Day received 9 nominations. For the Metrolina Native American Association, there were no nominations or recommendations made at this time. We will bring the Charlotte International Cabinet back to you, as several people received nominations, but none more than 6. For the Citizens Review Board, the 1 applicant received 9 nominations. Sadai Sudan received 9 nominations. And the Community Relations Committee, several individuals received nominations, so that will come back to you at your February 28th meeting. For the Domestic Violence Advisory Board, the 1 individual, Iman North, received 9 nominations. For the Historic District Commission, no applications have been received for the resident owner of Heritage Court representative. And for the Historic Landmarks Commission, Nadine Ford received 9 nominations. No applications were received for the Passenger Vehicle for Hire vacancy representing the hospitality tourism industry. And for Transit Services Advisory, no nominations were received for the Vanpool Rider category.
Motion to appoint all nominees receiving 6 or more votes tonight.
Second, Driggs.
We have a motion and a second. That is the nominations for those that did get the 9 votes: Business Inclusion Advisory Committee, Citizens Review Board, Domestic Violence Advisory, and the Historic Landmarks Commission. So with that, I'll begin the roll call vote. Mr. Newton?
Yes.
Ms. Watlington?
It's not me.
Ms. Watlington?
Yes.
All right, Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes.
Ms. Ajmira? Ms. Ajmira?
Yes.
Mr. Phipps?
Yes.
Mr. Winston?
Yes.
Mr. Bakari?
Yes.
Mr. Driggs?
Yes.
Mr. Eggleston?
Yes.
Mr. Graham?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
All right, with that, our Valentine's Day gift is to go home and celebrate, or be at home and celebrate, and thank you all for your attention, especially around the action items tonight. Have a great rest of your evening. This meeting's adjourned.
You too. Thank you.